Good morning. If we haven't met before, I'm Bill Fallon, Chairman of the Board of the Naval Historical Foundation, and welcome to the 94th Annual Membership Meeting. We are particularly honored this morning to have with us the newly installed Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Ken Braithwaite. Now, the Secretary's only been in his job for about 2 weeks, and one of the first things he's done is to come over and visit us in our office, and we're really pleased to have him with us this morning. He's a man that needs little introduction. Graduated from the Naval Academy in 1984, served for a decade as a naval aviator, P-3 pilot, went into public affairs, joined the Navy Reserve, and stayed in that for the rest of his career in various assignments around the world. His last one was as the Vice Chief of Information of the Navy. Very successful businessman and our recent ambassador to Norway. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome and introduce the Honorable Kenneth Braithwaite, the 77th Secretary of the Navy.
Good morning, and thank you all for your work to bring our Navy history to life. As a proud life member of the Naval Historical Foundation, I know how important it is to educate the American people about their Navy and their Marine Corps, and moreover to honor and remember every link in our chain from our early Revolutionary Navy to the sailors and Marines now standing the watch. Naval history is a central component to our readiness and to our capability, which is why one of my first actions as the 77th Secretary of the Navy, your Secretary, was to visit the Naval History and Heritage Command. We must connect with our past so that we can remember the rich fabric of our culture and attract those who will add to our story in the future. For nearly a century, you've worked alongside the office in which I am now privileged to serve. 94 years ago, one of my predecessors, Secretary of the Navy Curtis Wilbur, faced stiff headwinds and heavy seas in his efforts to convince the nation of the need for a strong and capable Navy. He helped establish this organization and looked to Commodore Dudley Knox to educate the American people about the importance of sea power in our nation's history. Together, they turned the tide, ultimately contributing to our preparation and victory in World War II and beyond. I'm grateful for their efforts then, and I'm grateful for your efforts now, because a strong and ready Navy has never been more important as we face greater challenges today than any time in our lives. I look forward to a strong partnership as we work together on projects such as reimagining the National Museum of the United States Navy and continuing to find ways to educate the American people on the importance of research, readiness, and service. You have a strong and dedicated advocate in me as I truly love our Navy and all it represents. I thank all of you for joining us today for this annual meeting and for your commitment to advance our mission of bringing the story of our Navy to life, a critically important part of our preparedness today and tomorrow. And now it's my honor to introduce my shipmate, Undersecretary of the Navy, Greg Slavonic. I look forward to working with and for you as your Secretary of the Navy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and good morning to all of you. Let me add my congratulations as the Naval Historical Foundation approaches its centennial. I'm also proud of my membership with the NHF. As I perform the duties of the Undersecretary of the Navy, I'm cognizant of the many talented individuals from diverse backgrounds who contribute to making our Navy and Marine Corps one of the most potent fighting forces that the world has known. I appreciate that a component of the DNA that goes into the makeup of our forces is an appreciation of our history and heritage. True history happens, but it really doesn't happen unless it's recorded, achieved, and analyzed by archivists and historians. This is why the work of the Naval Historical Foundation to bridge the academic community with those serving the nation is so vital. For us to be effective in the present, we need to understand the past. We wish you continued success in your ongoing efforts to make the history relevant to today's fleet. I understand Admiral Fallon will be providing you with a case study of one such successful endeavor. With that, Mr. Secretary, I echo your remarks in thanking our fellow members for the support and contribution to the Foundation. And now I have the privilege of turning the floor over to one of the Navy's most respected flag officer, Admiral Fox Fallon. Thank you.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 94th Annual Naval Historical Foundation Annual Membership Meeting. Every one of us today is a part of history on two accounts. First of all, this is virtual, as you know, the first time ever, but it also offers us an opportunity to have nationwide attendance and participation. I'm eager to find out how many folks actually join us from around the country and not just Washington, D.C. So welcome. Let me give you a rundown of what we have in store for you. We have a number of pre-recorded sessions, and we're going to hear from Admiral Sam Cox, who's the Director of Navy History and Heritage Command. You're going to get committee reports, and you're going to get a report from Dave Rosenberg, one of our board members, to talk about recognition. And then Sonny Masso, our executive director. We'll then move to live session to take care of voting, any old or new business, and then adjourn before Dr. Dave Winkler comes on to introduce Dr. Craig Symonds, who's going to be our Leighton lecturer today. And he's got a fascinating, entertaining talk for you entitled Hollywood and the Battle of the Atlantic. So we look forward to that. Without further ado, let me just step into a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank Sonny Masso, our executive director. He's been aboard for a little over a year now. He's got lots of enthusiasm. He's a ball of energy. He's got the office fired up. And actually, speaking of the office, if you haven't been by in a while, and I'm sure that applies to everyone since the Navy Yard's been locked down for a number of months now, but when you get a chance, come on in. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how neat, orderly, and attractive the office is. So Sonny, good on you. And I think the real kudos for that one go to Jacqueline Natter, who used her steely-eyed, sharp decorating skills to make the place look a lot more presentable. So thank you, Jackie and Sonny, and come on in and see us. A couple of things that I'll talk about. First of all, the challenges of this year notwithstanding, I think we're in pretty darn good shape. So yes, we've had to totally readjust to doing business. Yes, we have had to cancel or defer a number of events that we really we're looking forward to in live and in person, and we'll have to see how that plays out for the rest of the year. Financially, we're holding our own. You'll get the details on that one, but we've been helped immensely by a legacy gift from the Wild estate, and Mr. Wild was quite generous to us, and without it, we'd be probably borrowing from our investment account right now, but we're holding our own. And then I want to say that with each challenge comes an opportunity, as you well know. And the opportunity for us this year has been to take advantage of the technology that's available and to do things virtually. So we've just begun a number of initiatives. You'll hear more about them to give us an opportunity to attract a wide audience, to stay involved with naval history. And I think it offers us some opportunities going forward that we're probably going to maintain in the virtual electronic technology mode. That said, just to highlight a couple of other points. We did an event, we actually did two events that were sponsored by NHF and Center for Strategic and International Studies last year and the year before to try to bring attention to the nexus and mutual reliability of the Navy nuclear power program and the national commercial nuclear sector. So we had two public events, and I want to tell you that the follow-up to that is actually a very good story. In fact, better than I might have imagined. So after the second event, which we co-hosted, there was a public hearing held, a congressional hearing up in Pennsylvania. I was asked to testify. I did. At the time, I got a chance to speak with the governor of Pennsylvania and a number of congressmen and women. And the idea was to emphasize the importance of nuclear power, not just to the citizens in Pennsylvania that were enjoying the benefits of the electricity, but the significant ties to the Navy and the reliance of the Navy on the same contractor support and parts base and lots of other technology that we share with the commercial industry. The bottom line is that the power plant nearby the scene of the congressional hearing was actually acquired by a new investor. And although that plant had been earmarked for shutdown this year, the new owners elected to keep it open in no small measure due to the publicity and support they got in Pennsylvania as a, I think, pretty close result of our endeavors. So that's something I believe is of great interest to the Navy and will be supportive of our Navy nuclear power program going forward. So I think it was a relevant operation, relevant to the Navy's needs today, and we're actually seeing results. The next thing I want to mention is the relationship with the United States Naval Academy has been enhanced this past year with Dr. Dave Winkler being down there as the occupying the chair of the class of 57 at the Naval Academy, teaching history, and also being able to be on scene to help guide the third annual Superintendent's Leadership and Vision Awards that have been instigated and very generously supported by Dr. Jack London, one of our board members. And although we had to modify it extensively, you'll get some details about that to do it virtually this year. We had larger participation than previous years and some very interesting presentations by the students. So that was a big success. And you'll hear more about recognition from Dave Rosenberg when he comes up. I want to mention that we are looking forward to the future. I think that we'll be able to get back into live events here over the next several months. We'll look forward to that. And we're eagerly awaiting the opportunity to reschedule some of the events we had to defer and to look for new things going forward. The last thing I'd like to do is highlight, you're going to hear a couple of the committee reports, and some of our board members need a real tip of the fedora and a hand salute for doing great work. So the finance, Larry Marsh, riding herd on that, and audit, ably assisted by Vince, and also in the membership area, Jim Noone, actually a one-man show of late has been bringing that along. So kudos to Larry and Vince Griffith and to Jim Noone for their work. Last thing, I regret that time moves on, and during this past year, we lost some stalwart members of this organization, people that were very closely and long time affiliated. First and foremost, our longtime president and chairman, Jim Holloway, who passed away recently, and not soon after that, his wife Dabney also passed. They were married for 77 years. I don't think there are too many folks that could make that claim, but Jim Holloway has been a force that just difficult to describe the impact he's had on this organization as well as the Navy and the nation. So we miss him, we mourn him, but we're really grateful that he was with us for a long time. We also lost our first Knox Medal recipient, Phil Lundberg. Phil, very well known to many of you, a tremendous historian and of historical interest. He was one of 3 junior officers that survived the sinking of the last U.S. destroyer in the Atlantic, the Frederick C. Davis, in 1945, was the last casualty of the War of the Atlantic. You'll hear a little bit more about that in our Leighton lecture later on. But Phil was a wonderful man, and we'll miss him. Also, we lost the first executive director of the NHF, and that's Captain Dave Long. Very recently passed away. He spent a decade trying to keep this place on track and in the channel. And condolences there. And finally, you may recall that about the time of our annual meeting last year, we lost Herman Walk, the famous author and historian, at the grand old age of 103. So we'll miss all of them, but we look forward to enjoying hopefully long lives with the rest of you. And that'll be it for the reports. Let's switch over to the next section, which will be committee reports.
I'm Rear Admiral Julius Caesar, Executive Director of the United States Naval Academy Minority Association. It's my pleasure to introduce Captain Jim Noone to deliver the Membership Committee Report.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to report that our membership numbers are pretty good, particularly since we've been unable to have in-person events for the past 3 months. As you can appreciate, I'm sure, such events are instrumental in attracting new members. At the end of April, we had 1,049 members. This was the 6th straight month where we've been able to sustain membership above 1,000. And interestingly, it's the first time since we started doing monthly membership reports in 2016 where we've been able to have membership above 1,000 for 6 months in a row. Our previous best streak of over 1,000 members was for 5 months. Also, our current membership level compares favorably on a year-to-year basis. At the end of April 2019, a year ago, we had 1,006 members, 43 members less than our present membership. I'll come back to our April membership report shortly, but in order to provide some context, I'd like to briefly review our 2019 performance. Slide 1 shows the 2019 year-end situation compared to prior years, membership, new members, and renewals. Starting with membership, we finished, as I just said, last year with 1,006 members. This compared favorably with prior years, 694 at the end of 2016, 908 for 2017, and 1,131 at the end of 2018. Now that number, 1131 for 2018, is something of an outlier. We got 175 new members in December of 2018, most of them en masse at 2 Navy Museum events. Unfortunately, we did not have good contact data for many of them, and as a result, many eventually fell off our membership rolls. In 2019, we had 231 new members, which compares favorably with the prior years, except again for that 2018 outlier, 329 in 2018. I'll come back to that in a moment. 2017 in 126, 33, only 33 new members in 2016. Going back to that 2018 December new member surge, if we back out the 175 that were signed up en masse in December of 2018, the new member number for 2018 is 154. Now, one disappointing factor for last year was the renewal rate. As you see on the slide there, 44%. This was far below the prior year numbers. 2018, we had a great renewal year, 83%. 2017, 75%. 2016, we don't have solid numbers for 2016, but we believe the renewal rate was in the 60 to 70% range. The renewal rate is of critical importance. The staff has been working hard to improve it. But if we're going to substantially increase membership from year to year, our renewal rate really needs to be in the 70 to 80% range. Now, coming back to our current status, slide 2 here shows the April membership report. It's busy, a lot of numbers on there, but let me just refer to 3 significant items on this report. First, individual members. We have 297 individual members. That category has been declining in recent years. A year ago, April of 2019, we had 353 individual members. At $50 per member, that is a not insignificant loss of revenue. However, we have 67 digital members at $40 per member, which helps to make up for the lost individual category revenue. The third item I'd like to point to in our April report is our retention rate. Unfortunately, it hasn't shown much improvement so far this year, with only 50% of the 34 expirations signed up. However, half of the May expirations, 51 expirations in May, have already been renewed. We don't have the May membership report yet, but it should be a good month for renewals. As you can see there on the report, under expirations, June and July have sizable expiration numbers, and the staff is already working hard on those months and will continue to do so. Also, the staff has been clawing back to get expirations that were not renewed last year. We've already gotten a number of them. We don't have details yet, but we'll continue to work that. So, in conclusion, all things considered, it's an encouraging report, and I do believe that we'll see a substantial improvement in our retention rate this year. That concludes my report. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jeffrey Skunk Baxter, defense consultant and former member of the band Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers. In my consulting career, I was profoundly influenced by the late Vice Admiral Jim Doyle, who patiently groomed me to be a credible asset to several government agencies and organizations, including the Missile Defense Agency. Admiral Doyle loved naval history, and so do I. I've been very fortunate to work with stalwart naval officers throughout my career. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral Larry Marsh to deliver the Finance Committee report.
Greetings, everyone. It's nice to see you today, and it's good to have some new people with us. The finance report consists of three components: last year's 2019 summary, a report on our status so far this year, 2020, and a brief outlook. Slide 1. 2019 was a successful year for the foundation. We ended the year with a positive net operating revenue and over $189,000 in the bank. Our investment account with Vanguard gained almost $100,000. For the year, our cash assets increased over $127,000. Of note, however, we did need to withdraw $70,000 in August from the investment account to meet payroll and operating expenses at that time. Fortunately, we received over $230,000 in one-time donations in the fall, and that carried us through the rest of the year. So overall, it was a very good year. Slide 2. 2020 also began well, as we received the aforementioned second installment of the Wild Estate for $125,000. And then a little later, we applied for and were accepted to receive a grant through the Virus Payroll Protection Program. That was for $62,600. But we too have now suffered due to COVID-19. Specifically because we have had to cancel or postpone events, our net operating revenue has been on a steady decline. This is in spite of the significant early Wild Estate input and some back payments due from 2019. Net operating revenue is $65,000, but that likely will continue to drop. Understandably, we are just not generating revenue, while our minimum payroll and operating expenditures, of course, continue. Fortunately, our available cash in the bank from last year, from the Payroll Protection Program, the PPP, and from what we have generated thus far this year will enable us to continue for a finite period without needing to withdraw funds from the investment account. And the investment account continues to fluctuate with the market. We are maintaining an approximate 40-40-10, that's fixed equities and cash allocation model. The account balance continues at over $1 million. Slide 3. As you can see, we evaluate our financial status as guarded. Our ability to generate revenue remains the key issue. I now look forward to your comments and questions later. Thank you very much.
I'm Harold Bryant, the Executive Assistant here at the Naval Historical Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce our awards chairman, Dr. David Rosenberg.
Good morning. This is Dave Rosenberg. Happy to report on the Foundation Awards program. During March 2019, the Foundation hosted the second Voices of Maritime History competition for the Superintendent's Annual Leadership and Vision Award at the Naval Academy. This culminated in a presentation by Midshipman Anthony Perry of his paper titled Quelling Lawless Seas, 21st Century Barbary War, Lessons Learned from 1801 and Applications to Current Cyber War at an annual war dinner hosted by the Navy Museum on March 26th. In 2020, in contrast to the two inaugural competitions that featured in-person presentations before a panel of judges at the Naval Academy, followed by a celebratory dinner at the Navy Museum in Washington a week later, this year's contest was conducted online as a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic. Thus, on Tuesday, May 5th, the finalists virtually presented their papers to the judges from their individual homes. We congratulate Midshipman Joseph Bunyard, Anthony Iannacone, and Kelly Alcinis, selected as our respective first, second, and third place recipients of the 2020 Naval Academy Superintendent's Leadership and Vision Award. The three finalists displayed excellent knowledge of their chosen topics and defended their perspectives in front of the judging panel. All offered valuable insight into current Navy issues through the lens of history. The winning paper by Midshipman Bunyard was a review of contemporary challenges to network survivability in an era of great power competition. As one of the judges commented, it is intriguing how the author is able to relate experiences of great power competition, in this case between the Allies and Axis forces in World War II, to shed clarity on the types of issues the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps will confront in the decades ahead. In May 2019, the Foundation presented Midshipman First Class Hannah Herzl with his captain Edward L. Ned Beach Naval History Prize for her scholarship as a history major at the Naval Academy. For 2020, the Beach Prize went to Midshipman First Class Joe Koch, a student in the oral history course taught by the class of 1957 Chair of Naval Heritage, Dr. Dave Winkler. Midshipman Koch completed a project with the end objective of publishing a book on the role of the class of 1957 played in the Vietnam War. Midshipman Koch photocopied the Lucky Bag class entries and class reunion books, posted source material, and coordinated the writing of 15 chapters. Recently commissioned, Ensign Koch is directing an oral history project to document the impact of COVID-19 at the Naval Academy. Throughout the spring of 2019, the Naval Historical Foundation again sponsored the Vice Admiral Robert F. Dunn History Essay Competition, soliciting scholarly papers from NROTC units located on campuses across the country. Midshipman John Cesars of the University of San Diego won the competition for his essay titled The Evaluation of the Six Cornerstones of Fleet Combat. Regional winners included Midshipman Jack Swords of Holy Cross, Midshipman Vaughn Allen of Iowa State, and Midshipman Mason Husong of the University of Kansas. Regional runner-up awards went to Midshipman Aidan Perry of the University of San Diego, Midshipman Kyle Daly of San Diego State University, Midshipman Morgan LaSala of the University of Notre Dame, and Midshipman Jonathan Halterd of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. The deadline for submissions of the 2020 done essays is 30 June at the end of this month. The Naval Historical Foundation awarded a junior and a senior Captain Ken Koski Prize at the National History Day competitions. Caval and Ella Ratliff of Edison Middle School in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, collaborated on a winning website project entitled The Art of Confusion, The Triumph of Dazzle Camouflage After Tragedy. Armin Needles of Mililani High School in Hawaii received a prize for creating a performance titled Hawaii's Workers Assist U.S. Triumph After Tragic Pearl Harbor Bombing. In addition, the foundation continued a Teachers of Distinction Recognition program to salute those teachers who encourage their students to research topics with naval history themes for National History Day. This year's National History Day will be a virtual event. Finally, we return to the Knox Lifetime Achievement Medal. In September 2019, the foundation recognized retired Commander Tyrone Martin, Dr. David Skaggs, and Mr. Norman Polmar with the Commodore Dudley Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Naval History at a banquet following the McMullen Naval History Symposium in Annapolis. The Naval Historical Foundation intends to bestow the Knox Lifetime Achievement Medal on historians at a future date. A selection committee, including NHF board members and prior Knox Award winners, has considered the nominees. The historians chosen are Dr. Michael Crawford, former senior historian and head of early history at the Naval History and Heritage Command, whose record of scholarship on 18th, 19th, and early 20th century naval history has made thousands of documents available to historians and whose publications have broken new ground for others to follow. Retired Captain Peter Schwartz of the Center for Naval Analyses, whose many publications on the development of Cold War and post-Cold War U.S. naval strategy and policy have established the conceptual and documentary framework for understanding the process and impact of modern naval thought, and whose mentoring has enriched the understanding of naval history and strategy of scores of naval professionals, from junior officers to senior flags and graduate students to senior professors. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rear Admiral Sinclair Harris, U.S. Navy retired President of the National Naval Officers Association, National Vice President of the Navy League of the United States, and a proud life member of the Naval Historical Foundation. It is my honor to introduce Rear Admiral Sam Cox, Director, Naval History and Heritage Command, and Curator of the Navy, to deliver his report. Over to you, Sam.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sam Cox, the Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command. And first off, I'd like to thank Admiral Fallon and Admiral Masso and the entire Naval Historical Foundation team for the extraordinary partnership that we have. We've had a relationship going back to Dudley Knox's era in different incarnations. I would assess that it's the strongest relationship we've had at any time since. So we're grateful for the support from NHF. This is actually a pretty exciting time for NHHC. And as an example, last Friday, I was told to show up at the Secretary of the Navy's office, not expecting that I was going to be his first order of business after his installation ceremony. And I met with him and his family. He drug his whole family in, and the acting Undersecretary Slavonic. And he said he was doing that on purpose to send a message of how important naval history is to him and how important he thinks NHHC can be in helping him accomplish his mission. And he said, he talked at length about the extraordinary progress that NHHF has made, NHHC has made in the last years. He gave me way too much credit because it's actually due to the great people that we have here. But it's pretty exciting to have that level of top cover right now, and we look forward to a great relationship with him. We are operating in a degraded mode due to the COVID-19 issue. Our museums, archives, and Navy Department Library are closed to the public. On the silver lining is that you can actually get a lot of backlog work done when you don't have to deal with people. That's kind of cruel, but when you get lemons, make lemonade, and that's what we're doing. One thing that's not affected is our social media platforms, which for those who may not know are the fourth most popular in the United States Navy. So we're continuing to connect with the American people, providing a lot of connection, the history of the U.S. Navy, and it's almost always a positive story. So that remains a good news story, and our web platforms continue to get awards from the Navy for best blog post and things like that. So that's going like gangbusters right now. I want to focus on some of our infrastructure projects, and in particular one that I think will be of most interest to NHF. But the first one, you may recall that in 2017 we completed the first major overhaul on the Constitution since 1997. And when I said we brought it in ahead of schedule and under budget, former Secretary of the Navy, Spencer, about fell out of his chair because he'd never heard those words before, but we did. Well, now we're embarked on an even more complex project, which is to the first dry docking and major overhaul of the Nautilus since 1981 or two. And right now we're in the middle of a $5 million evaluation period, and the intent will be that she will go into the dry dock in the first quarter of 2022. We had to do extensive work with Naval Reactors and Naval Sea Systems Command in order to get, develop an actual, no kidding, maintenance standard for museum submarines, because the initial estimates were based on a submarine that could actually go underwater. And if this one goes underwater with the handicap ramp in the bow, she's never coming up again. So that was actually able to bring the cost down by a lot to the point where we saved the Navy, $104 million in life cycle costs over the summer. It'd still be a big bill, but it's a lot less than scrapping her. So, which is a big bill no one will want either. So that's actually on track. The other major project is the Operational Archives and Research Center, which right now is a $41 million repair project on two old buildings that are on the Navy Yard compound, and it'll be basically building a new building inside the old shell. And that will be the new home for the archives, the Navy Department Library, art collection, photo collection, underwater archaeology collection, everything that requires a higher level of environmental control in order to preserve it for the long haul. This is actually the largest, infrastructure project in our naval history infrastructure project in our history, and it's a pretty big deal. And it's all on track. It's all funded. Right now we're doing the musical chairs with the art and the books and things like that, getting ready for major construction, which will help soon. But one thing that we're really excited about, and where NHF will be, I think, the biggest partner with us, is in trying to relocate the National Museum of the United States Navy off the Washington Navy Yard. As many of you know, it's very difficult to get the American people in there because of the security requirements to get on base. So instead of getting 1 to 2 million people a year like we should if we were outside the fence line, we get 100,000, and most of them are DoD CAT card holders. Although we're getting a lot more honor flights than we were before, up until the virus put a halt on everything. But right now, the Navy is engaged with a number of stakeholders in a very complex land swap process in order to acquire the property for the new museum, which will be right outside the main gate of the Navy Yard, 6-minute walk from the Washington Metro. That spot the Navy at one point owned it, gave it away back in the 1960s. Most of it was a vacant field that served as a de facto force protection standoff for Naval Reactors Headquarters and Naval Sea Systems Command Headquarters. Well, if you've been around the Navy Yard lately, that neighborhood is now booming, and the developer was getting good offers on it. And if they were to build condos there, then the Navy gets a really, really big bill to either move those headquarters or bring them up to force protection standards. So C&O Richardson looked at the cost of doing those versus the cost of acquiring the property and went, this is a no-brainer, I'll buy the land. And oh, by the way, numerous studies have said it's the best spot in the United States for the National Museum of the United States Navy. And I think it got briefed very well to Congress because they weren't sold on the force protection argument, but they did say, okay, but you can swap land for it. We won't let you spend money to buy it, but you could swap. So the idea was to trade land on the other side of the river at Anacostia for the land that we want. The developer would buy the land that get the land we want, then we would swap for it. Well, it got complex because of the White House Communications Agency and the President's Helicopter Squadron and the National Park Service Helicopter Squadron. And at first it looked like this whole thing was going to crash and burn, but they actually found a way to do this in a way that makes everybody happy. And I won't go into all the details, but the city's happy, the National Park Service is happy, everyone, and so this is moving forward with admittedly some kind of glacial pace, but given how many fingers are in the pot, it's actually moving forward. So I think we're not that far away from one day saying, hey, we've got the land, and we'll get the Secretary of the Navy to announce that, hey, we are in fact going to build this museum, and then I just got to find somebody to raise a whole lot of money. But we've done a lot of work in design of the building a new part, and there's actually 3 old buildings and then the vacant area involved in this, so it's actually a campus and not just one new building. And we put a lot of work into the design so that we can phase it. There's no way you're going to be able to raise that much money and build it all at the same time. But that's the way, the Marine Corps did it successfully. The Air Force has done it that way. The Army kind of built it at once, but it took them 15 years to raise the money. We're hoping that we'll be able to do better than that. So with that, I think I've probably reached the limit of my time here. Again, I greatly appreciate everything NHF does for NHHC, and we look forward to a continued productive relationship in what I think, and I hope everyone is well. So far, we've had no one come down with the virus, or either get sick or die from it, and we certainly hope to keep it that way. And hopefully, the same is true for you too. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sean Bland, and I'm the Director of Membership Programs here at the Naval Historical Foundation, as well as a chaplain candidate program officer in the United States Navy Reserves. If you're enjoying this program and are not currently a member, please consider coming on board and supporting our mission by going online and registering with us on our website, navyhistory.org. Please enjoy this message and presentation by our Executive Director, Rear Admiral Retired, Sonny Masso.
Good afternoon. My name is Rear Admiral Sonny Masso, the Executive Director of the Naval Historical Foundation. I would like to thank you all for participating in our Foundation's annual meeting from states far and wide. Last year, 2019, marked the 75th anniversary of the momentous events of 1944 as the United States pushed toward final victory in Europe and the Pacific during the Second World War. In response to this anniversary, we focused our activities and events, Pull Together magazine, and our Thursday Tidings to commemorate this critical year of the war. Related to that conflict, the NHF mourned the loss of 3 warriors who fought in World War II and who were very close to our foundation. Our Dudley Knox Medal recipient, Dr. Phil Lundenberg, noted author Herman Wouk, and our NHF Chairman Emeritus and former Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral James L. Holloway III. Our annual meeting last June featured a commemoration of the landings at Normandy by Dr. Brooke Blades, who spoke as our annual David T. Leighton lecturer, sharing his research and book on the naval photography during the amphibious landings on D-Day. Later that evening, at our 5-star dining out event, Royal Navy Commodore Andrew Betton spoke of the Royal Navy's role during D-Day. The NHF, again, joined with other Navy support organizations to co-host the annual Midway night dinner at the Army-Navy Country Club, featuring author Ms. Lisa Mundy, who wrote Code Girls, detailing the women who contributed to breaking Japanese codes. In September, the NHF hosted a reception for Navy Secretary Richard Spencer in the National Museum of the United States Navy just prior to his departure from the administration. We currently are planning to host a virtual reception for the new secretary in the near future, if not a live event. Stay tuned for more details on that. In October, we hosted an event at the historic Decatur House, just across the street from the White House, celebrating Leyte Gulf at 75. Most of you know this already, but we have a national treasure on our board of directors, Dr. David Rosenberg, from the Institute of Defense Analytics. He assembled and moderated a phenomenal panel of authors, including Lieutenant Commander Tom Cutler, Mr. Trent Hone, Captain David Kennedy, Mr. Andrew Taylor, and Mr. Paul Stillwell, who took us through the entire battle from every angle of history. We were proud to have Admiral James Sandy Winnefeld provide our keynote and closing remarks. The program was covered by C-SPAN, and many of you were able to watch it a week or so later. During the year, the NHF completed the naval documents of the American Revolution Digitization Project that was made possible by a National Maritime Heritage Grant and a matching grant by Mr. Andrew Taylor of Enterprise Holdings. Researchers now have digital access to the 13-volume series containing thousands of documents pertaining to the birth of our Navy. With the help of our members, we reviewed 55 naval history books, many written by you, our members, on our now weekly Navy history book reviews. Our webmaster and director of membership services, Ensign Sean Bland, has incorporated naval history book reviews into our weekly briefing called Thursday Tidings, featuring book reviews, author chats, calls for papers, and historical articles germane to current events. There's an occasional sea story there as well that I think you'll enjoy. Starting soon, we will begin hosting virtual symposia featuring topics that we hope will draw large audiences. Your foundation does what it does for you, our members. We love our Navy and nation, and we celebrate through evidence-based history, event anniversaries, and through storytelling of those sailors whose heroics changed the tide of battles and made a difference through their sacrifices. Please consider asking your friends, family, and former shipmates to join our foundation. Please consider converting your annual membership to a life membership. Drop us a line and tell us what interests you. Read our Thursday Tidings each week and our pulled together magazines throughout the year. We at the foundation are unfazed by the COVID-19 pandemic. We will push the finest content to you via virtual means. Stand by for future notifications on this program and programming and live events we hope to schedule later this year. On one final note, it is my honor and pleasure and privilege to announce our Volunteer of the Year for 2019, Miss Tatiana Pushnig. Tatiana joined us last summer for an internship from George Mason University. Her work on our behalf, particularly on our website, and also on conducting important historical research, was magnificent and deeply appreciated. Congratulations, Tatiana. Fair winds and following seas to you all. Be safe and healthy during this time, and thank you for your support. Good morning, and welcome to the end of the business portion of our annual meeting. If you're interested, statistically, we have 116 attendees representing 30 states, as well as participants from Denmark, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Spain. On behalf of the entire Naval Historical Foundation leadership team, we thank you. So now we embark on NHF constitutional housekeeping, where we must vote as a membership on several issues. When I bring up the specific vote, you will see a ballot cross your screen. Merely check aye or nay and hit the send, and you will have voted. I remind the audience that only NHF members may vote, and I appreciate your compliance. So let us begin. The first vote is to approve the minutes of our 2019 annual meeting. Please vote now. Thank you very much. The ayes have it, and the minutes are approved. Next, we must vote on our 4 proposed and approved by the NHF Board of Directors candidates. The candidates are Vice Admiral Walter T. Ted Slapshot Carter, United States Navy retired, Mr. Matthew Bergman, Vice Admiral John Christensen, and Captain Jerry Hendricks. Please vote now, A or nay. And the ayes have it. Congratulations to our newest board members as voted by our Naval Historical Foundation membership. I appreciate that. I now turn the meeting back over to our chairman, Admiral William J. Fallon. Over to you, sir.
Well, Sonny, thanks very much. And first order of old business here as we begin to wrap up is kudos to you and the staff, and particularly to our committee members on the board that have put this presentation together. And pretty amazing with our advanced age that you're able to make this technology work, but well done to each of you. I want to add my personal thanks and also my congratulations to the Knox Award selection winners, Dr. Michael Crawford and Peter Schwartz. Well done, and we'll look forward to seeing you in person one of these days and hopefully be able to present these awards live. Last comment, I'd like to thank the members who have been so generous to us in helping us out during this stressing time of COVID with your donations to help us keep functioning here, and solicit your continued support from all the members to enable us to operate from month to month and to keep this organization going. And also, as your means may permit, to consider leaving a legacy donation for us when your time is complete here on this shipboard tour on Earth. I'd like to switch to a couple of bits of new business, but first a comment. If you have any old business or any new business that you want to raise, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email and ask the question or raise the issue, and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. So from time to time, the foundation provides special recognition for exceptional performance. And I'd like to highlight a couple of people. We've selected retired Rear Admiral Bud Langston, our former president, to receive the Admiral Bruce DeMars Award in recognition of his exceptional, substantial contributions to this organization over his 4 years of service. Bud, congrats. We'll look forward to seeing you in person. And the last thing is that there's a very, very special award called the Naval Historical Foundation Distinguished Service Award. And we intend to present this to Mr. Jim Hornfisher, a board member renowned historian, in recognition of his efforts to promote naval history throughout the nation. But Jim has authored a number of best-selling books. He's been a mentor to many people in and around naval history, and he's been a superb ambassador for naval history throughout the world. So Jim, again, we'll look forward to being able to recognize you in person. With that, I'm going to wrap it up, send it back to Sonny for the adjournment. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Finally, our last vote today is to adjourn the business portion of today's annual meeting so that you can hear our exciting speaker, Dr. Symonds. Please vote now to adjourn the business portion of our annual meeting. The ayes have it. The meeting is adjourned. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our Naval Historical Foundation historian and professor of history at the United States Naval Academy as the class of 1957 chair, Dr. David Winkler, to segue our program to our David T. Leighton speaker.
Thank you, Sonny. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Craig Symonds to present the Naval Historical Foundation's annual David T. Leighton Lecture. The lecture is presented following the annual membership meeting in honor of Commander Leighton, who had the distinction of being the first individual ever to get a degree in nuclear engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He would play an important role in Admiral Hyman Rickover's Naval Reactor Organization, where he became close friends with an up-and-coming naval officer by the name of Jim Holloway. Sharing Admiral Holloway's passion for naval history, Commander Leighton's generosity helped to make the Navy Museum's Cold War Gallery a reality. As for Dr. Symonds, he has just finished up a 3-year tour as the visiting Ernest J. Professor of Maritime History at the Naval War College. Before that, he had spent much of his academic career teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy, where at first he had earned a reputation as the preeminent Civil War naval historian. A recipient of the Naval Historical Foundation's Commodore Dudley Knox Award for 2014, as well as other honors, in recent years, Dr. Symonds has focused on 20th century naval history. His book, Neptune, The Allied Invasion of Europe and the D-Day Landings, earned him a Samuel Eliot Morrison Award for Naval Literature. Not surprisingly, his expertise has been in demand, as illustrated recently when Tom Hanks tapped him to be a consultant on the forthcoming movie Greyhound. To discuss just how helpful Craig was to that endeavor, we reached out to Tom Hanks. Over to you, Mr. Hanks.
Hi, Tom Hanks, and I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to Dr. Craig Symonds, who was the very first and most important and impressive technical advisor and booster of the motion picture Greyhound. He was very familiar with C.S. Forester's original novel, The Good Shepherd, from which Greyhound was adapted. He was also extremely gracious in his sharing of information, time, and conducting a fabulous tour of the United States Naval Academy there in Annapolis, which was the stomping grounds and alma mater, if that's the right way of saying it, for the character Captain Ernest Krause, who I play in the motion picture. His constant and non-judgmental, but opinion and expertise in regards to a number of the iterations of the screenplay were incredibly valuable because it told us, number one, that we were going in the right direction, and number two, had some things that we had to get right. So without Craig, Dr. Craig Symonds, I don't think the movie would have progressed as well as it did in the time that it did. So many, many thanks and congratulations.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dave, for the introduction, and thank you, Tom Hanks, for that entirely undeserved encomium to my very small part in bringing your movie to the big screen, although since it's going to be an Apple production, it's not quite as big a screen as originally intended. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you to celebrate the Naval Historical Foundation 94 years of supporting and promoting naval history. Special congratulations to Mike Crawford and Peter Schwartz for their selection as Knox Award Medal recipients. I was also very delighted to hear from both Secretary Braithwaite and from Sam Cox that serious consideration and progress is being made to create an opportunity for the general public to take a greater advantage of the Naval Museum. I think that's an absolutely wonderful thing. That is too great a national treasure to be locked behind bars, and I really look forward to the day when it can be shared more widely. I did not know that the Naval Historical Foundation was going to have Tom Hanks introduce me in the way that he did, but it's quite an honor. Dave asked me to talk about this subject, about my relatively small role in the production of the new movie, Greyhound, and to tie it into the actual events that it depicts. Now, despite what Tom just told you, my role in this project was fairly small, but it began about 3 years ago when Tom called me pretty much out of the blue to ask if he could talk to me about a movie script that concerned the Battle of the Atlantic. And it was actually, of course, based on a novel. This novel. As you can see, it's been through many printings. The dust cover on the left is from the original 1955 edition, and the one on the right is emblazoned with a plug for the new film. The book was written, as you can see, by C.S. Forester, whom I will admit up front is one of my favorite all-time authors. Here he is. As you can see, C.S. Forester was his pen name. He's often described as being a British author, but was actually born, as you can see on the slide, in Cairo, Egypt, in the last year of the 19th century. After World War II, he moved to California and eventually became an American citizen, but he never fully lost his British accent. Now, he's best known, of course, as the author of the acclaimed Hornblower novels, of which there are a total of 11. When I was a boy, I must have been, I don't know, 9 or 10, I suppose. My parents had a 1945 edition of the novel Commodore Hornblower on a shelf next to the library in the living room. And one day I picked it up and opened it. It is not too much of an exaggeration to say it changed my life. After reading Commodore Hornblower twice, I then sought out and read the rest of the Hornblower novels, and I have revisited them several times since. When I am occasionally asked how I became a naval historian, the answer that I give, which is entirely accurate, is that it is all C.S. Forester's fault. If you have never read these books, let me urge you to do so. It doesn't matter in what order you read them. As I've already confessed, I did not read them in the order of the character or in the order in which Forester wrote them, which is also not chronological. The first book with Hornblower as a major character was called Flying Colors. And it's about a British naval captain commanding a frigate in, of all places, the South Pacific during the Napoleonic Wars. It was such a success, the publisher convinced Forester to write 2 more novels about this introspective and thoughtful ship captain, ship of the line, and beat to quarters. Often these 3 novels are grouped together into one very large volume called Captain Horatio Hornblower, depicted here with its dramatic dust cover rendered in the unmistakable style of N.C. Wyeth, who I suspect probably did the cover art for at least half the books I read as a boy. All 3 of these novels were written and published before the war, between 1936 and 1938. It was not until after the war, in 1951, that they were turned into a film with Gregory Peck in the starring role as Hornblower and Virginia Mayo as his love interest, Lady Barbara Wellesley, who Hornblower fans will know was, of course, the sister of Lord Wellington, no less. Forester wrote the screenplay for the film as well as the book it's based on, and he discovered that he had a knack for it. And he was very much soon in demand as a screenplay writer. He moved to Hollywood. He wrote 8 more screenplays, including some of the better known movies in Hollywood's golden era, including these, The African Queen and The Pride and the Passion, both based on novels that he wrote, both film from screenplays that he wrote. Now, the title changed slightly. The Pride and the Passion was originally named The Gun, but I guess Hollywood producers decided The Gun was too prosaic a title for a hit film. And perhaps that is also why The Good Shepherd got retitled for the movie version. Also, while Forrester did write the novel, The Good Shepherd, he did not write the screenplay for this movie. The author of the screenplay was this fellow, who of course we have already heard from this afternoon. Tom Hanks read the book, liked it, thought it would make a good movie, and bought the rights to it. Then he sat down to write a screenplay, but he wanted to make sure he got the details right. And I suppose that's why he called me and came down to Annapolis by train, where my good friend Tom Cutler and I met him at the New Carrollton Metro Station. Says a lot, I think, about his seriousness of purpose as an artist, that he was determined to get all the small things right. He had sent us the script in advance and was, as he suggested already, pretty receptive to just about everything we had to suggest. The only thing Tom Cutler and I had to argue with him about was how his character, who is George Krause in the book, but Ernest Krause in the film, how his character would address the messman who brought up his coffee to the bridge. Tom Hanks wanted to imply a friendly, jocular relationship between his character, the captain of the ship, and this particular messman whose name was Cleveland. So in the script, Tom has his character address him as Mr. Cleveland. Well, Tom Cutler and I told Tom Hanks that would never happen. Not in 1943, not in 2017. Hanks resisted that. He suggested that, well, maybe the captain would call him Mr. Cleveland in a teasing, friendly sort of way. No, that simply would not be historically accurate. And Tom Hanks grumbled a bit about that, but I think he agreed. Now, I have to confess, I have not seen this particular scene yet. So when you see the movie, and of course, all of you should do so, look for that. See if he's Cleveland or Mr. Cleveland. Of course, Tom Hanks also wanted to get the big things right, and that is to make sure that the history portrayed on the film, in the screen, was correct. And he had a big head start in that goal because Forrester was another one who wanted to get the big things right, who wanted the history to be correct, and he nearly always did. He was careful to make sure that his Hornblower novels were impeccably accurate in depicting the working of a sailing ship in the 18th century. He was just as careful about his depiction of a United States destroyer in the middle of the 20th century. Indeed, because of his careful attention to nautical detail, many often assume that Forrester himself must have served in the Royal Navy. Actually, he did not. And interestingly, he failed the physical when he tried to enlist. He did, however, spend significant time at sea, including a lengthy cruise on a tramp steamer from Central America to Britain in the 1930s. But he learned about American destroyers by serving on the USS Admiral Reed, on which he took a Pacific cruise in 1943, in the middle of the war. That in itself is noteworthy because Forrester was not yet an American citizen. He became one, as I mentioned, after emigrating to America after the war. But in 1942 and 43, he was still a British citizen and was employed, in fact, by the British government to write articles for public publication that would help cement the Anglo-American relationship. The US Navy's PR department was fully on board with this idea, and that is why Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox wrote a set of orders for British citizen C.S. Forrester, stamped secret, to join the ship's company of a US Navy destroyer and write what amounted to a puff piece about Anglo-American unity. Now, Forrester's escort officer on the Admiral Reed, his babysitter, if you would, was a lieutenant named John Hoddap. Hoddap and Forrester actually became pretty good friends, as you tend to do on a lengthy cruise in the Pacific. Years later, in fact, HODAP would write the foreword to the Naval Institute edition of the Good Shepherd, which is still in print. In several of their many conversations, HODAP told Forrester about one of his previous COs, not the one on the Abner Reed, but in a previous command, who had been prone to quoting Bible verses. His name was Commander George Hunter. George. Forrester was intrigued and asked HODAP to describe this man in some detail. And so it was George Hunter who became the inspiration for George Krause in The Good Shepherd, though Hanks changed the first name of the principal character from George to Ernest for the movie. I don't know whether that was in tribute to Ernest J. King or to indicate that he was an earnest man, maybe both. Forrester left the Abner Reed in June of 1943. 2 months later, in August, this ship, hit a Japanese mine and 85 feet of the stern was blown off and sank, though rather miraculously, the rest of the ship somehow managed to stay afloat. 71 of the Abner Reed's crew were lost in that mishap. Forrester might well have been one of them had he not left the ship 2 months previously. And if that had been the case, more than half of the Hornblower novels would never have been written, nor, of course, would The Good Shepherd. Now, the ship in the book and in the film is technically a Mahan-class destroyer, which is curious because the Abner Reed, which of course was the inspiration to Forrester for the story, is a Fletcher-class destroyer. And so too was the ship that Hanks used for the film, which is the USS Kidd, DD 661, now a museum ship moored near Baton Rouge and the river in Louisiana. The current USS Kidd, by the way, DDG 100, has also been in the news lately, interestingly enough, for an outbreak of COVID-19. There are a total of only 4 Fletcher-class destroyers still extant, all of them museum ships. But the other 3 had all been frammed, had been modernized. So the Kidd is the only one that retains her World War II configuration. Now, Hanks couldn't film on the bridge scenes inside the bridge on the Kidd because the small bridge would not accommodate the camera, the crew, the producer, the director. So the outdoor scenes were filmed on the Kidd with a lot of help, as you will see, from CGI computer graphics. To depict the ship underway and maneuvering and all sorts of things that the magic of computer enhancement can do. And for the bridge scenes, Hanks' company built a replica bridge on shore with open sides so that the camera crew could look into the bridge. So, did they get the big things right? Where does Forrester's and Hanks' fictionalized destroyer fit into the history of the Battle of the Atlantic? Let me try to answer that by spending a few minutes talking about the Battle of the Atlantic. I called this talk Hollywood and History, so let's look at the history part for a few minutes. The Battle of the Atlantic was made up of at least 3 phases. You could probably subdivide it further if you wanted to be technical about it, but I think the 3-phase model helps us understand the way it broke down. That first phase, from the British declaration of war in September of 1939 until the entry of the United States into the war in December of 1941, was for the Allies by far the most precarious. Now, the British knew from their experience in the First World War that convoys, like the one we see here, were the best counter strategy to the U-boat threat. And so they instituted a convoy system from the very first day of the war, technically even before the war began. But they had to rely on their own resources for escorts. The United States was not yet a belligerent. There was the tiny Canadian Navy, but by and large, the escorts that were available to carry these convoys safely across the ocean were all Royal Navy ships. And the Royal Navy was desperately short of escorts, especially destroyers. And it got a lot worse very quickly. The British lost 9 destroyers in the evacuation from Dunkirk, and they lost 6 more during the campaign for Norway. Now, destroyers, of course, were then, and for that matter still are now, the workhorses of the Navy and needed for all sorts of duties. And the result was a crippling shortage of destroyers in particular, but escorts of any kind throughout 1940 and 1941. So the British improvised. They found help wherever they could. Some of that help came from foreign navies. Now, in both the novel, The Good Shepherd, and in the film Greyhound, one of the convoy escorts under the command of Tom Hanks' character is a Polish destroyer, the Victor. And in fact, both Polish and Norwegian destroyers did participate as convoy escorts in this first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. But there were too few of them as well. And most of the escorts in this first phase were necessarily British ships. So to make up for the shortage in destroyers, the British relied heavily on a new small vessel called a corvette, like this one. As you can see, they were small. In fact, some were as small as 500 tons, though 900 tons was more typical. They were also weak, with only one 3-inch gun on the foredeck. And finally, to complete the trifecta, they were also slow, with a maximum speed of only about 16 knots, which technically was 1 knot slower than a surfaced U-boat could make. They were known as flower-class corvettes because each of them was named for a flower. You can see here, this is the HMS Clover. But there were also Royal Navy warships in World War II called Bluebell, Buttercup, Honeysuckle, and Zinnia. And we might giggle at that today. But without these ships, the transatlantic sea lanes may have been cut altogether. Because they were so small, they were also very uncomfortable to serve in. The novelist Nicholas Montserrat, author of The Cruel Sea, which, by the way, is another novel that all of you should read sometime in your life, actually served in a flower-class corvette during the war, and he wrote about it afterward. Here's a passage. Maybe some of this will sound familiar to you. Every night, for 17 nights on end, you're woken up at 10 to 4 by the bosun's mate, and you stare at the deck head and think, my God, I can't go up there again in the dark and filthy rain and stand another 4 hours of it. But you can, of course. So small, slow, weak, uncomfortable, they may have been. But they did have ASDIC, the British name for sonar, and depth charges. They were cheap to build, and so the British built a lot of them. They and the Canadians eventually built a total of 269 of them, but relatively few were available in 1940 or even 1941. So until 1942, and the American entry into the war, the British made do with whatever they could cobble together. A measure of British desperation for escorts was the decision to rely on what were called armed merchant cruisers. Here's one of them, I hope. There it is. They were essentially civilian transport ships, often cargo ships, with a few guns bolted on the deck that were manned by Royal Navy volunteers. They had relatively few guns, no armor at all. And with typical caustic humor, the sailors who served on them claimed that AMC actually stood for Admiralty-made coffins. Unprepossessing as they were better than nothing, although just barely. During this first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic, some British convoys put out from Halifax with 40 merchant ships and only one armed merchant cruiser as an escort. Imagine 40 merchant ships zigzagging across the North Atlantic at 6 to 8 knots with just this for protection. Churchill, of course, was desperate for more escorts, and he all but begged Roosevelt for some of the old World War I era mothball destroyers, each of which had 4 smokestacks and were therefore known generally as 4-stackers. This particular 4-stacker is a rather famous one, the USS Reuben James, was the first US Navy ship to be sunk in World War II, torpedoed by a German U-boat in October of 1941. October of 41, that's still 2 months before Pearl Harbor. While she was accompanying, Franklin Roosevelt refused to admit it was actually doing escorting, accompanying a British convoy in the North Atlantic. This was part of what amounted to an undeclared naval war between a handful of US Navy warships, many of them four-stackers like this one, and German U-boats. Though the shooting and the dying was real enough, neither the US nor Germany was willing to make it official and declare war. FDR, because he knew the public and Congress would not support it, and Hitler, because he was determined to finish off the Soviet Union first before taking on the United States. But FDR was willing to go as far as he could short of war to support the British, and in particular the British transatlantic convoys. That included Lend-Lease, of course, and what is known as the destroyer deal. In a famous arrangement in September of 1940, the United States gave Britain 50 of these old four-stack destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. I suspect that Roosevelt would have been happy just to give them away, but Congress wouldn't stand for that and insisted that he get something in return. And in the end, he actually struck a pretty good deal. 50 old destroyers out of mothballs for a century's worth of new bases. And it may well have saved Britain from defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic during this critical first phase. Now, phase 2 of the Battle of the Atlantic can be said to have begun on December 11th, 1941. Not the 7th of December, not Pearl Harbor Day, because initially the United States did not declare war on Germany the next day, on the 8th. Not until Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th. So phase 2 took place from December 1941 to the spring of 1943, which is when the tide turned in the Battle of the Atlantic. This is also when the action in the movie Greyhound took place, in that critical tipping point. With the United States now fully in the war, American destroyers, like the fictional Greyhound, beefed up the size and the strength of the convoy escorts. Now, a escort, rather than having one AMC or one Corvette as an escort, might have 4 or 5 destroyers plus a Corvette. The senior naval officer was called the escort commander and coordinated the defense when the convoy came under attack. This is the role that Tom Hanks' character plays in the movie. There was also a convoy commander who was a civilian, although most often this was a retired naval officer, often even a former flag officer who rowed one of the merchant ships and was responsible for maintaining the cohesion of the convoys and executing the maneuvers that were ordered by the escort commander. The escort force in the book, and the movie too, consists of 4 destroyers, Greyhound, of course, and 3 others, including the Polish destroyer Winkler. The most important aspect of this second phase of the Battle of the Atlantic takes place off screen, is not really in the movie. And it is, as this image suggests, the unprecedented and frankly astonishing shipbuilding that took place in the United States from 1942 onward. In part, of course, this consisted of building new escorts that could accompany the convoys. And in 1942, destroyers were the highest production priority in US industry. In addition to that, however, US shipyards built the transports and cargo ships to replace those that had been lost to the U-boats. It's a rather cold-blooded calculation, but in effect, by 1943, the United States was able to build ships faster than the Germans could sink them. So part of the story of the Battle of the Atlantic was what we see in Forrester's book and in Hank's movie, Allied escorts fending off repeated attacks by German U-boats. But it is also a story about the construction of replacement ships for those that were lost to the U-boats. Both were necessary. This chart here shows the number of Allied ships sunk in black, which, as you can see, went upward dramatically from 1939 to 1942, when it got pretty frightening at about 1,700 ships, and then dropped off dramatically in 1943. That drop was due to the kind of activity that we see depicted in the movie Greyhound. But in addition to that, and not depicted in Greyhound, the bars in red show the construction of new shipping, which starts out very low in 1939, barely visible on this chart, and begins to rise in 1942 and then takes off in 1943. Note those numbers on the left of the graph. That red bar in 1943 nearly reaches the 2,000 level, representing the construction of 2,000 new deep draft transport ships within a single year. So I said that the action in Greyhound takes place in this time period, but exactly when? Forrester did not peg his story to a particular month. He meant for it to represent the kind of combat that took place in the North Atlantic and the toll that it took on those charged with getting it safely across the ocean. But given the circumstances, we can probably place it in those pivotal few months between March and May of 1943, when the balance of power in the Atlantic was tipping, but had not yet fully tipped. Nor did Forrester put the action he depicts in a particular place. But again, the evidence suggests that it very likely happened in the critical air gap, that area in mid-ocean where the convoys could not be covered by planes from Newfoundland, Iceland, or Scotland. In fact, it is possible that the convoy that Forrester had in mind when he wrote the book was this one. Convoy HX-229 sailed on March 8th, 1943. The HX designation, by the way, indicates that it departed from Halifax, but in fact, this particular convoy left New York. It consisted of 40 merchant ships. That's pretty much standard size for a convoy, though some were larger than that. Escorted by 4 destroyers and a corvette, roughly the size of the force that Krauss commands in the book, and of course, in the movie. Karl Dönitz, the German U-boat commander, found out about it and sent not 1, but 3 wolf packs toward its position, determined to annihilate it altogether. What that meant was that a total of 37 U-boats were all vectored toward the coordinates of this one convoy. A little bit of a spoiler alert here. There is a scene in the movie, quite moving in my opinion, that shows Hanks, that is Krauss, bent over the radar repeater and seeing the number of blips multiply out over the horizon as he realizes and appreciates the number of wolves coming to attack his sheep. It's quite a chilling moment and accurate. A week out, convoy HX-229 actually overtook a larger and slower convoy, SC-122, in mid-ocean. That is right in that air gap here in the middle of this slide, just to the right of the fold. That's where the battle took place. Now, Forrester does not include SC-122 in the storyline. It's not in the movie either. I think it would have complicated the sea duel that both Forrester and Hanks wanted to depict. But the kind of battle that is depicted, with the U-boats attacking at night and on the surface over a period of several nights, and with the outnumbered and harried escorts attempting to fend them off, that's pretty much what played out over 3 consecutive nights from March 16th to March 19th of 1943. Hanks, by the way, does a little better in the film than the Allied escorts of HX-229 did. In the actual battle, Dönitz's U-boat sank 22 Allied ships and lost only 1 sub. But this battle in March marked the last real strategic success of the U-boats. 2 months later, at the end of this tipping point in May 1943, in another duel between escorts and wolf packs, the defenders of convoy SC-130 were far more successful. Over 2 days, May 19th and 20th, the escorts sank 3 U-boats and damaged a 4th and did not lose a single ship. The difference between these 2 convoys, the one in March and the one in May, that marked the tipping point in the Battle of the Atlantic, and arguably at least in the Second World War. Forrester's book and Hank's film is set at just the moment when that balance tipped. From this point on, we can label combat in the Atlantic as Phase 3, from May of 1943 up to the end of the war. Now, one thing that characterized this 3rd phase and helped tip the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic was the employment of several new weapons systems which Tom Hanks and his crew did not have to hand. First, there was the Hedgehog. In Phase 1 and Phase 2, destroyers and destroyer escorts attacked U-boats by passing over their presumed location and rolling barrel-shaped depth charges onto them. A Hedgehog, however, allowed them to be aggressors rather than defenders. The Hedgehog was located on the foredeck and fired these 70-pound Torpex torpedoes out in front of the ship in an elliptical pattern, which allowed the escorts to take on the role of an attacker, and they did. Another important weapon system that changed the dynamic of the Battle of the Atlantic was the ability to deploy small escort aircraft carriers. This one is the USS Bogue, which in fact was the very first auxiliary carrier to be deployed on convoy escort duty. The existence of these ships allowed the air gap to be erased altogether, allowed the convoys to bring their air cover with them. It was, in a phrase, a game changer. A third new weapon the Allies deployed in this phase of the war was a new kind of escort, essentially a bulked up version of the British corvette, called appropriately enough a destroyer escort. The British actually called them frigates. These innovations, combined with the explosion of American shipbuilding, which we saw previously in this slide, and of course the dedication and commitment of men like George Krauss or Ernest Krauss, and all those he represents, are what allowed the Allies to win the Battle of the Atlantic. I hope you enjoy the movie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Symonds, for honoring our annual meeting immensely. I know our members and viewers will have some questions. For your questions, please use your Q&A button, not chat, Q&A, which you'll find below on your screen to ask your question. I'll serve as the moderator. I'll read the questions only from the Q&A, not from the chat. And it's just noteworthy to say that the movie Greyhound will be released to Apple Television on July 10th, 2020. So just a couple days shy of a month from today, according to Wikipedia. You may find it a day or two slipped, but according to Wikipedia, the movie will be released on July the 10th. Dr. Symonds, that was amazing, and I look forward. I've already got 4 questions, and let me begin. The first one is by a gentleman named P.S. Hickey. Why hasn't been there more recognition about the naval action in the Atlantic? And there have been some great battles like the sinking of the Bismarck and Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare with the Wolfpack tactic, thus leading to the development and use of depth charges, and I assume hedgehogs as well. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Symonds? And thank you for the question, Mr. Hickey.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I agree with the premise behind it. I think it's true that the Battle of the Atlantic has not received the kind of attention that we give, for example, and rightly so, to more dramatic short-term battles like Midway, Leyte Gulf, Philippine Sea, even the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. These took place within usually one 24-hour period. And because of that, they are a moment in history. The Battle of the Atlantic took place over 2.5 years, longer, depending on where you want to start it and where you want to claim that it ended. We already heard that Phil Lundeberg was a survivor of the last American ship sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1945. So even though the tipping point comes in the spring of 1943, that battle continues until almost literally the last day of the war. And because it took place, it's kind of a running hum rather than an exclamation point. I think there's a tendency on the part of the popular students of the war to undervalue its strategic importance in maintaining an Allied relationship and the ability to build up for D-Day. Good question.
Yes, sir. And Mr. McCormick asks, please say more, if you haven't already, about the competition and cooperation between the mathematical analysis behind the convoy concept and the professional expertise and tradition of individual naval strategies.
Wow, that's a handful. I'm not sure that my mathematics are sufficiently sophisticated to give you the algorithm that was used by the British in Trade Plot and, of course, by Atlantic Command in the United States. There was a great deal of cooperation, but also a great deal of conflict about the construction, the design, the route of convoys. I didn't even mention the impact, of course, of code breaking. The Allies, the British in particular, at Bletchley Park, had broken the German code and knew when Dönitz would vector out wolf packs toward a convoy. They would then, after breaking that message, notify the convoy and the escort commander to change their course to avoid the wolf pack. What fewer people knew, even now, is that the Germans had also broken the British convoy codes. So they would break that code and then re-vector the wolf pack. So one of the sub rosa confrontations that was going on here was between the code breakers on both sides as to who could operationalize that information more swiftly. And the British turned out to be a little bit better at that than the Germans were. But there was also conflict between the Americans and the British about how many escorts were appropriate, how soon and when to create Atlantic coast convoys. There was, of course, the great loss of ships off Cape Hatteras, particularly in the early months of 1942. The British urged the Americans to have convoys there. Ernest King not resented, but kind of slow-footed that. That's a whole separate conversation we can have. But there's a lot of analysis, a lot of disagreement, as well as cooperation went into the creation of these convoys. It was a very complex system.
Great answer. Thank you, sir. Mr. Reif asks, what type of sonar sets were U.S. destroyers equipped with in March to May 1943? And per the trailer, he can't but wonder how wise it would be for a German U-boat commander to taunt a destroyer on open comms, saying something like, "Good luck surviving the night, Greyhound." Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, the expansion and improvement of technology during the war is absolutely phenomenal. Radar, probably even more than sonar. Radar barely existed in 1939 when the war began. Most ships didn't have it. Virtually no airplanes had it. By 1943, by this tipping point, every ship had it and most airplanes had it. So the advent of radar plays an enormous role in finding, tracking, and avoiding the wolf packs. Sonar also existed. The British, starting with ASDIC and using the Echo system, were ahead of the Americans for much of this. The Americans caught up rather swiftly, and both sides were using sonar / ASDIC very effectively. By 1943, along with the Hedgehog and the escort aircraft carriers, it's a critical weapon, a technological advance that allows the Allies to overcome the U-boat threat. There was a third part of that question that I probably forgot.
I think you got it pretty well, sir.
Okay, good.
Okay, one of our board members from the Pacific Northwest, from Seattle specifically, and a dear friend, Mr. Matthew Bergman, asks, what mistakes did the Germans make in the War of the Atlantic that may have resulted in a different outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Karl Dönitz was absolutely convinced and argued vociferously as he could that every single U-boat that was available should be put to work on the North Atlantic sea lanes. And it annoyed him to no end when Hitler intervened, as he frequently did, not only in land operations, but in naval operations as well, even though he really didn't think much of naval operations. But he insisted in sending 20 U-boats into the Mediterranean. He insisted in sending 20 U-boats up to Norway because he was convinced Norway was the decisive front. And this isn't 1940 during the Norway campaign, this is 1943. So every time Dönitz got one of those orders, he gritted his teeth and obeyed the orders. But in his view, if he had been able, number one, to make U-boats the highest production priority in the German industrial system, and number two, to deploy all of those U-boats in the North Atlantic sea lanes, he could have ended this thing by 1941, 42, before the United States even became much of a player. And because that was not allowed, the Germans really, to use a famous phrase used by Chamberlain to describe Hitler, the Germans missed the bus on this. Their moment was in 1941, early 42, when had Dönitz had his way, it might have been strategically decisive.
Thank you, sir. We have a life member named Walter Haskins calling in from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we're delighted that that part of the country is represented. And he asks if you could speak to whether the Germans preferentially targeted the commercial vessels as contrasted with the escorts, and if the former, why? And if the escorts were in such short count, why not take them out first and then have your way with the cargo ships?
Yeah, that was a great question. Let me make a cultural distinction, first of all, between the Atlantic and the Pacific. In the Pacific, the Japanese, in their warrior culture, did target warships. They had a higher priority than merchant ships. I mean, what glory, what honor is there in sinking a merchant ship that doesn't even fight back? Far better, in their view, to sink a warship. Dönitz had exactly the opposite view. He had what he called a tonnage strategy, and the idea was to destroy as much shipping tonnage as possible. It didn't matter whether it was full of equipment and heading east, or empty and ballast and heading west. You sink the ships. Once you reach a critical moment, when there are an insufficient number of ships to carry the goods necessary to supply and even feed the British population, Britain would have no choice but to surrender. So his orders to his U-boat commanders and the Wolfpack captains was try to avoid the escorts, just stay out of their way, and sink those merchant ships, as many as you can. First, the bigger ones. Tankers are nice, but it almost doesn't matter. Sink as many ships as possible, sink as much tonnage as possible. And when he gave out the Iron Cross medals when they came back from a tour, the key index for that was what tonnage did you sink on this cruise. So that was his goal. And if you look at the numbers, which can also be graphed, the tonnage numbers got alarmingly high, as much as 800,000 tons a month in late 42, before they began to taper off and drop again. And those are the numbers that Dönitz was convinced would break Britain in their island.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Symonds. This is a very closely related question, and it comes from another one of our board members who's one of the driving forces behind the Institute of Defense Analytics. He's a retired intelligence officer in the United States Navy. He says, do you have any comments on the role of ultra code breaking in the critical change in the Battle of the Atlantic? And it could not be referred to in the movie due to the fact that Commander Krauss would not have been cleared, but we intel types, speaking for himself, think the breaking of the 3 or 4 rotor Enigma machines and the creation of over 90 large analog computer bombs at the National Class Register used by more than 3,000 waves at the National Security Station in Washington, D.C. may have informed some intelligence information. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's, I'm not going to get into a conversation about the technology of this, but it is absolutely true that the Enigma machine, which encoded and then decoded the orders to the wolf packs, the Germans added a fourth rotor to their naval Enigma, not to the Wehrmacht, by the way, just to the naval, at which point the Allies went blind in terms of trying to break the code. Now, not for you who asked the question, because I know you know this, but perhaps for some of our other listeners, it's important to know that when we say code breaking, we don't mean that we're reading in real time the literal message itself. We're getting enough of that message to intuit what's likely to happen, and the timing of that, whether you get it within 12 hours or 36 hours to operationalize it, that is critical. So what was happening in the Battle of the Atlantic, as I mentioned earlier, was that the Germans were cracking the British convoy codes, but more importantly, the British, the Allies generally, were cracking Donitz's naval code. And when they went blind briefly, the numbers shot up. You can actually track this on a chart. You can see that when, they added that fourth rotor, there's a greater lag time now between the messages that are sent and the time that we can read enough of them to make a response. During that time, the tonnage numbers shot up rather dramatically. So there clearly is an impact here. But Dönitz himself was reluctant to believe that his code was broken. He just could not believe it. And he convinced himself that the British and Americans had very effective HFDUF, high frequency direction finding units, not only on shore, but in airplanes, and they were triangulating all this. And this is how they were finding out where the wolf packs were. And really right up till the end of the war would not believe that the Allies had managed somehow to break into the Enigma code. But it's a big part of the story, without a doubt.
We have a question from Germany from a dear friend of the Naval Historical Foundation and the Historical and Heritage Command, George Schimmelfennig. And by the way, George, I'm holding up your Christmas card that you gave me. I just opened it, but thank you for that. But he asks, quite often historians are looking for the one decisive battle in World War II naval warfare. Midway might be the perfect candidate in contrast to a mere, i.e. rather unspectacular war of attrition. Has there been a single event during the Battle of Atlantic that might qualify for a kind of semi-decisive battle?
Often I've seen others point to, I mentioned SC-130, which I think is one decisive moment. There was a number of people have suggested that OS-5, an unladen convoy from Scotland going back to the Western Hemisphere that was attacked, where 7 U-boats were sunk without any losses to the convoy. There are a number of these. One of the U-boats that went down in another convoy was actually, the first officer of that was 19-year-old Peter Dönitz, who was the Admiral's son. And it was immediately in the wake of that massacre of U-boats that Dönitz called off any further efforts to interrupt with the North Atlantic sea lanes and sent the U-boats south to see if he could do something with the convoys from Freetown and Gibraltar. So in a way, it's almost like admitting defeat. And we know from a message that a letter he wrote to Hitler himself saying, we cannot win the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies simply have too much wherewithal for us to deal with that effectively. But I don't know what else to do except keep sinking ships, and that's what Hitler told him to do. It's an utterly bankrupt strategy to admit that it won't work, it can't be decisive any longer, but we're just going to keep doing it anyway because I can't think of what else to do. And it goes back to the very first question. I think the answer to your question goes back to the first question I talked about, which is that it's a long, slow erosion of U-boat capability and a very slow buildup of Allied capability that we see tipping, almost like a teeter-totter. We see it tipping in May of '93, and it just doesn't have the splash impact of Midway, of which I am also a huge fan. Midway was a very important battle. But it took place within effectively a 5 to 8 minute period, whereas the Battle of the Atlantic took place within about a 3-year period. So finding that tipping point is harder to do in the Battle of the Atlantic.
Thank you, sir. These questions are extraordinary, so I'm going to keep going if you don't mind. But Dr. Bill Dudley, who was the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command for decades and a close friend of many of us online today, asks, the Germans adjusted to Allied tactics and inventions as they changed, didn't they?
Oh, Bill, why are you always putting me on the spot? We can have a nice long conversation about this over a glass of wine. Yes, it's true. Both sides adjusted. I think what you see taking place in the Battle of the Atlantic, because it was a long-term campaign and not a single event, you see each side making adjustments. And some of those adjustments were critical. I tried to highlight those in the last couple of minutes of my talk with the Hedgehog and the air cover and the destroyer escorts and simply the shipbuilding itself that essentially is what doomed the whole idea of a guerre de course campaign by the Germans. But the Germans also came up with new devices. You know, they had the Schnorkel, which they added to their newer submarines. They had the Type 21 and 23, which are really the first modern submarines. Up to then, the Type 7 U-boats that were the kind of workhorses of the fleet were submersibles. They operated on the surface, they attacked on the surface, and only submerged in order to escape or avoid detection. But the Type 21 and 23, they were genuine submarines. They had the bottlenose bow so that they operated better submerged than on the surface, and in fact, were faster submerged than convoys on the surface. So they, again, had they been employed in 1940-41, that too could have been strategically decisive, but they didn't exist in 1940 and 1941. And the Schnorkel allowed diesel engines to operate while submerged, bringing in oxygen to the engines so that they could transit, for example, the Bay of Biscay from their French seaports undiscovered until they got to the hunting ground. So each side is adding new technological innovations as it goes. You can almost see this battle taking place.
So this next question is very interesting, and it comes from a leader in the Association of Naval Aviation. He is the editor-in-chief of Wings of Gold, which is just a magnificent periodical. If you've not read it, read it today. But his name is David Callsign Face Kennedy. I cruised with him 3 times in my career, and he was one of our distinguished panelists on our Leyte Gulf at 75 panel that we discussed earlier. But his question is really interesting because this really goes to the nature of how does history inform today and tomorrow. So with that context, he asks that the German direct management of their deployed subs resulted in lack of initiative and independence of action, in contrast to that mode of operations characteristic of United States submarine operations. Is this an issue, or is this an issue that it should be cautionary or a cautionary lesson for current C4I doctrines, which embrace more direct command and control and reliance on real-time communications?
Yes, is my answer to that. You know, the way this emerged in the German command system is that Dönitz's original idea, which he really invented during the First World War when he was a young junior officer and realized when he was on a single submarine and had an entire convoy in front of him, oh, if only I had 4 or 5 or 6 submarines, I could wipe out this entire convoy. And that idea stayed with him all through the interwar period, so that when World War II began, he was focused already on the idea of coordinating a large number of U-boats against convoys rather than sending them out singly to hunt as lone wolves. And initially, he left the initiative in that to the at-sea commanders. The idea was if you spotted a convoy, you were to notify U-boats in your area yourself, and then they would vector themselves to the target. And he did this during the Norway campaign and during the early campaign in the North Atlantic. And he decided on what mathematical basis, I don't know, that it was far more efficient if the sighting submarine notified him by radio and that he then vectored other vessels to the target. And I think his notion was that I'm in a position to know where every U-boat is, or at least is supposed to be, in the North Atlantic, so that I can determine which boat should be sent to which targets. That centralization of command decision-making, that was entirely his. Maybe it's partly German, maybe it's partly his own personality, maybe he just wanted to be in control and have his hand on it. You know, there's an instinct. If you're in command, you want to be able to, this is going to be on me. It's my responsibility. So by golly, I want to be the one making the decision. As you point out, in the Pacific, by and large, the Americans were lone wolves. Now, they did operate later in 1944 and 45 in combined action groups, which were colloquially known as wolf packs of 3 and sometimes 4 American submarines working together. But by and large, the initiative there, except for the intervention from Ultra, by and large, the initiative was left in the hands of the at-sea commander. Now, if an Ultra decrypt came in and they said, well, we know, for example, of a convoy carrying a division from China to the Philippines, which did happen, and a couple of wolf packs were vectored by Central Command out of Brisbane, Australia. But that was the exception rather than the rule. And you're right, there's a difference here between the individual initiative of the commander at sea and the centralized control of the commander on the ground. In Dunitz's case at Courneval, near Saint-Nazaire on the French coast. And that's a difference in doctrine.
Sir, going back, and this will be the last question, and I'm so sorry we can't get to them all, but we just can't. But back in the day, a lot was made of Bobby Fischer versus Boris Spassky, and I would argue that for a young junior officer, there was a system called NAVTAG, and a lieutenant commander named Neil Byrne and a lieutenant commander named Bill Keating did better than Spassky and Fischer in showing us how, us young junior officers, how to really play at a tactical level. And so Bill Rogers asked this question, which kind of falls in line. There's been much recent attention on the Royal Navy's use of wargaming to learn ASW and the Western Approaches Tactical Unit. Did the U.S. Navy have similar capability back in this day?
I'm not aware of it. I know I'm at the War College now, of course, and wargaming is very much part of our legacy and heritage. And wargaming in the 1930s focused primarily on Japan, the execution of Plan Orange, primarily on the confrontation of lines of battleships, slugging it out in a latter-day Jutland. And those war games were carried on almost nonstop at the War College. Wargaming continues today, most of it electronic. I am not aware that a lot of the wargaming in the 1930s, prior to American entry in the war, focused particularly on convoy defense. And again, I think it's partly a legacy of an attitude within the high command that there's something less glamorous about convoy defense than there is about lines of battleships slugging it out at a distance. And that's a cautionary tale. Because while we might think about, well, we want a nuclear power carrier group to demonstrate American seriousness of purpose in some particular part of the globe, but it may in the end come down to much smaller vessels handled in much different ways against enemies we don't even know about yet.
Thank you, sir. One final comment before I turn it over to our chairman, Admiral Fallon, to send us home, is that we were immensely honored to have participation from the United States Naval Institute, the National Naval Officers Association, the Navy League of the United States, Surface Navy Association, the United States Navy Memorial, the Submarine League of the United States, the Association of Naval Aviation, and the family of folks from the Wings of Gold periodical. Your questions were amazing. And I'm so sorry we couldn't get to them all, but you are here at the right place. The Naval Historical Foundation is going to be promoting some content in the near future, and I urge you to look at our Thursday tidings, because we get exactly into the business that you were hungry for and that you so well articulated in your questions to our phenomenal speaker. So I want to thank everybody for being here. From my standpoint, I am at eMasso, that's an easy one, EMASSO at NavyHistory.org. I look forward to your questions and your concerns. And if you ever have any ideas for Thursday tidings, we'll take a round turn on it. We'll do the research and we'll provide it for you. So thank you very much. And it's a distinct honor to turn this over to the greatest chairman of any institution, organization, or foundation, Admiral Fallon. Thank you, Admiral, for your leadership.
Hey, Sonny, enough of that. Craig, just outstanding to the team. I think it worked very well, particularly for an inaugural event. So we'll see what feedback we get from those that were tuned in and observed. But for my 2 cents, a great big bravo Zulu. To all those who tuned in to watch, please help us. We need new members, new blood, particularly looking for younger people. And be hanging there. We're going to make it interesting. I think you'll see a lot to like over the next year. So thanks for coming with us. And we will terminate now. Look forward to seeing you all next year. Out here.